Hello, everyone. I am storyteller and writer Dale Jarvis, and I am sending you greetings all the way from Canada. Hello. Miss Leedham sent me your questions about being an author and about being a storyteller, and I'm going to answer some of them, I hope. And so I'm going to start with the first one that I picked out from the list of questions that you sent. When did you start writing stories? I've been writing stories for a long time. When I was a student, when I was very young, when I was maybe 10 years old, I was writing little tiny stories. And I loved to write poetry when I was older, when I was a teenager, and when I was at university, I wrote poetry. And I started writing stories as a newspaper writer maybe 10 years ago. So I've been writing for a long time, though my writing has changed over the years. I'll read the next two questions together because they're similar. The first question is, how long have you been telling stories? And the second question is, how long have you been writing and telling good stories? And that's a question from Caitlin. And Caitlin, I don't know what you're suggesting. Are you suggesting that I told bad stories for a very long time and only recently I've started to tell good stories? I think you're sneaky, Caitlin. Someone's going to keep an eye on you. I've been telling stories for about 17 years, I guess. I've been telling ghost stories for about 15 years. And I have a business in the town that I live in called the St. John's Haunted Hike. And I take people around and I tell them ghost stories in the places where those stories are supposed to have happened. I've been doing other kinds of storytelling. I tell stories in schools and I tell stories for adults. I tell true stories, I tell ghost stories, and I tell a lot of stories about folklore and local fairy tales. I tell a lot of stories about Jack. I'm sure some of you have heard the story of Jack and the Beanstalk. Well, the part of Canada where I live, in Newfoundland, which is an island off the northeast coast of Canada, we have a lot of stories about Jack as well, who goes off and has adventures, and I love telling those types of stories. The next question is, did you always want to be a story writer or storyteller? And no, I didn't. When I was young, I wanted to be an archaeologist. I wanted to go around and dig up bones and explore old ruins and work with artifacts. And when I went to university, that's what I studied. I studied how to be an archaeologist. And then I went back and I studied folklore, which is the study of culture and traditions and old customs and superstitions and things like that. And I kind of fell into being a story writer and storyteller. It wasn't something that I ever thought that I would end up doing, but now that I am doing it, I love it. I really love it. I love sharing stories and telling stories. The next question is, what is it about ghost stories in particular that I like? Well, I love stories that are a little creepy. I love gross stuff. I love, stories that have dead bodies and people buried alive and things like that. I love stories that get people a little bit freaked out. I love scaring people, so that's always fun. And so I love telling those types of stories where it's kind of strange things happen. I like mystery and I like suspense. Where is the most unusual place you have told a story? Well, I just came home a little while ago from a festival in Belgium at a place called Aldenbiezen, which is a castle. And I told stories in the castle, and I got to tell ghost stories down in the cellar, down underground at the castle. And that was fabulous. We don't have a lot of castles in Canada, so it was nice to be able to tell ghost stories in a very spooky location. So that was one of my favorite places, more unusual places I've ever told a story. How long did it take you to write all the stories in The Golden Leg? The stories in The Golden Leg kind of came from a bunch of different places. So some were stories that I had told for a long time, so they were really easy to write. And some of them were stories that I researched and then wrote. So the book took me maybe 5 or 6 months, I guess, of writing and editing and working and polishing the stories and getting them the way I liked before they were finished. And then it took probably another half a year for the book to be edited and laid out and printed and published. So it took about a year, I guess, from the time I started till the time that the book was on the shelves. Which one of them do you like telling the most? I like two of them. The first one is The Golden Leg. That's my favorite story in the collection, where the woman is buried with a golden leg, and the man goes and steals the leg, and then her ghost comes back looking for it. I love telling that story because when I tell that story, there's a great moment at the end of the story where the man has to go back to the graveyard, and he stands above the grave, and he says in a very quiet voice, hoping that the woman won't hear, he says, "Mistress, what is it you want?" And from underneath the earth comes the woman's voice, and she cries out, "It is you I want!" And I always jump out at the audience when I tell that bit, and everyone gets scared. That's my favorite part. The other story I love is the story about Dragon Alley, which is a ghost story that's originally from Singapore, a Chinese ghost story. And I love the ghost in that because it has no feet and it just kind of glides along. I always thought that was kind of a creepy ghost to have no feet. Where do you get your ideas for the stories? Well, I read a lot and I find stories in old books, but I also love talking to people and asking them if they know any ghost stories or other kinds of stories. I do a lot of work collecting stories from people, and everyone has a story. Everyone has memories and little stories about where their families came from or strange things that happened. So what I always encourage people to do who are starting to write and look for stories is to listen, be a good listener, and to ask people. Ask your grandfather or your next door neighbor or the man that works in the shop. Ask them if they know any stories or if they have memories of things. Ask them if they believe in ghosts and see what they say. You might learn a story. There's lots of stories floating around out there, and there might be a place that's near you that has a ghost story. And the last question is, how many hours a day do you work on story writing, and are you writing a new book now? Well, I don't write every single day. Some writers do, but I have another job that I love as well, that I help organize events and organize festivals, and I help communities find their stories. So I work a lot at that. But I write a newspaper column. So every other week I have a new story that I have to write for the newspaper. And I find that really helps me as a writer because I have a deadline that I have to write to. It means that every 2 weeks I need to write a new story. And so when I do that, after a couple of years, I have, 50 odd stories that I can put into a book. So that type of writing helps me pull stories together. It helps me continuously write. When I'm working on a specific book project, I'll sometimes take a couple weeks and just work at nothing else other than that book. And I'm always working on new books, and I have kind of 2 books, I guess, that I'm sort of starting to work on now. One is another book of ghost stories, and I'm also starting to write about Christmas. I'm writing a book about Christmas traditions. So I'm going to be going and collecting a lot of stories and interviewing people. And I have a little digital sound recorder, and I'm going to be going around and interviewing people about their Christmas memories and writing a book about that. And so hopefully in a year that book will be finished and it'll be out for Christmas, a year from this Christmas. Hopefully I'll have that book of Christmas stories out. So that's what I'm working on. And I guess to finish off, I just want to encourage you to write your stories. Everyone has a story, and write it down. I look back at those first stories that I wrote when I was 10 or 12 years old, and maybe they weren't the best stories ever, but I'm glad that I wrote them down, and I think that it helped me become a writer later on in life. So listen to stories and tell stories and write stories. That's how we become better storytellers and writers, is just by practicing. And anyone can do it. So I encourage you to go out and do it. And thank you for reading my book. And who knows, maybe one day you'll meet me and we can share some stories together. Bye.